On the morning of May 29, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Watanabe Yasuji clung to debris in the cold Philippine Sea, watching his submarine, I-16, slip beneath the surface for the final time. An American destroyer escort, USS George, had depth-charged them mercilessly for 3 hours. The last thing Watanabe saw before abandoning ship was the destroyer's hull number painted in crisp white letters, DE 697. He'd been trained at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy to recognize every class of American warship. Fletcher-class destroyers, he knew. Cleveland-class cruisers, he'd memorized. But these smaller vessels, these destroyer escorts appearing in the Pacific by the dozens, then by the hundreds, represented something his instructors had never prepared him for. They shouldn't exist. Not in these numbers, not this fast. When George's sailors pulled Watanabe from the water 6 hours later, he was one of 19 survivors from I-16's crew of 94. As he sat shivering on the destroyer escort's deck, wrapped in an American blanket, he asked his guard a question in broken English. "How old is your ship?" The young sailor smiled. 6 months, he said. 6 months from keel to combat. Watanabe didn't believe him. I couldn't believe him. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, building a destroyer took a year, sometimes longer. These smaller vessels, even designed for simplicity, should require 8 to 10 months minimum. That was the immutable mathematics of shipbuilding, or so every Japanese naval architect had assumed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The destroyer escort program began not from American innovation, but from British desperation. By late 1940, German U-boats were eviscerating British merchant shipping in the Atlantic. Over 2 million tons sunk in 1940 alone, climbing to over 6 million tons in 1942 after America entered the war. The Royal Navy possessed powerful fleet destroyers, ships like the Tribal class that could hunt submarines effectively. But these vessels were too valuable, too expensive, and too few to assign to every vulnerable convoy crossing the Atlantic. Britain needed a vessel specifically designed for one mission: kill submarines while escorting slow merchant ships, not fast enough to screen battleships, not powerful enough to engage surface raiders, just competent enough to turn U-boat hunting from a specialized art into mass-produced warfare. In June 1941, months before Pearl Harbor pulled America into the conflict, British naval architects approached the U.S. Bureau of Ships with detailed specifications for what they called the British destroyer escort. The design philosophy was brutal in its practicality: length of approximately 300 feet, requiring a fraction of the horsepower of a fleet. A destroyer to achieve 20 knots, sufficient speed to keep pace with the slowest cargo hauler, armament focused entirely on anti-submarine warfare, depth charges, hedgehog projectors, sonar, radar, surface guns, keep them minimal, 3-inch mounts adequate for deterring surfaced submarines. Torpedoes, unnecessary weight for a ship that would never engage in surface torpedo duels. The British specifications arrived at the perfect moment. American shipyards were already tooling up for war production, but Liberty ships and fleet destroyers consumed every available berth at traditional naval yards. The destroyer escort could be built at facilities never before trusted with warship construction. Yards operated by companies with zero naval experience, using construction techniques borrowed more from merchant shipping than warships. Captain E. L. Cochrane of the American Bureau of Shipping refined the British design throughout late 1941. The result was a vessel that traditional naval architects viewed with barely concealed horror. It violated every principle of warship design they'd spent careers perfecting. Too small, under 1,500 tons displacement. Too slow, maximum speed of 21 knots when fleet destroyers made 35. Too cheap, projected cost under $3 million when a proper Fletcher-class destroyer cost $6 million. But Cochrane understood something the traditionalists didn't. The Atlantic was hemorrhaging Allied shipping faster than replacements could be built. Every week without adequate escort vessels meant another 50,000 tons of cargo sent to the bottom, another 100 merchant sailors drowned. Perfect warships delivered in 2 years would be worthless. Adequate warships delivered in 6 months might save the war. On November 12, 1941, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy placed orders for 50 destroyer escorts. The first vessels would be built at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California under the Lend-Lease program, primarily for transfer to Britain's Royal Navy. Design plans existed, construction schedules looked achievable. Then December 7th arrived, and every calculation changed overnight. Pearl Harbor transformed destroyer escort production from British lifeline to American necessity. The Japanese attack had crippled the USS Pacific Fleet's battleship force. But the submarine threat Japan posed was fundamentally different from Germany's U-boat campaign. Japanese submarines targeted warships, not cargo vessels. Their doctrine emphasized fleet engagements, not commerce raiding. This meant destroyer escorts in the Pacific would serve different masters than their Atlantic cousins. But the arithmetic remained brutal. The United States faced a 2-ocean war with insufficient escort vessels for either theater. Between November 1941 and July 1943, the U.S. Navy would place orders for over 1,000 destroyer escorts across 6 different classes. 1,000. In 19 months. For context, the Imperial Japanese Navy had commissioned approximately 170 destroyers of all types between 1919 and 1941, over 22 years of construction. The scale seemed impossible. American naval yards were already backlogged, building fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, and fleet destroyers. Where would these 1,000 escort vessels come from? The answer arrived from the least likely source. Civilian shipyards operated by construction companies and industrialists who'd never built anything more complex than cargo ships, and in some cases had never built ships at all. Herman and George Brown operated Brown Root, a construction company based in Houston, Texas. They'd built highways, dams, and naval facilities, but 0 ships. In August 1941, they'd taken over contracts for submarine chasers from another company and established Brown shipbuilding on a narrow waterway called Green's Bayou off the Houston Ship Channel. The location was absurd for shipbuilding. Green's Bayou was so narrow that vessels had to be launched sideways into the water, sliding off rails perpendicular to the channel, rather than the traditional bow-first launch-down slipways. Traditional naval architects predicted disaster. The Browns had no shipbuilding experience, an impossible location, and would be competing for skilled labor against established Gulf Coast yards. Their first submarine chaser, PC-565, completed in less than 7 months. The Navy took notice. In 1942, Brown Shipbuilding received contracts for 12 submarine chasers and 61 destroyer escorts. 61 warships from a company that had been building highways 2 years earlier. The Browns weren't alone in this industrial improvisation. Consolidated Steel Corporation in Orange, Texas, another facility without destroyer building heritage, received contracts for 85 destroyer escorts. Dravo Corporation in Pittsburgh, known for building river barges, would build destroyer escorts on inland waterways. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, actually experienced with warship construction, would build Ruddero-class destroyer escorts with 5-inch guns instead of the standard 3-inch armament. By mid-1942, 16 different American shipyards were building destroyer escorts, most of them operated by companies learning naval construction in real time. This decentralization terrified Navy planners. Fleet destroyers were built at specialized facilities, where experienced supervisors maintained rigorous quality control. These new yards would be staffed by workers who'd never seen a warship, building vessels that had to withstand depth-charge explosions, rough seas, and enemy action. A single construction defect could sink a ship and kill its crew of 200 men. The first destroyer escort commissioned into U.S. Navy service, USS Evarts DE-5, completed at Mare Island in April 1943, took approximately 9 months from keel laying to commissioning. 9 months wasn't terrible for a complex warship built by a yard learning new construction techniques, but it wasn't remotely fast enough. The U-boat crisis was peaking. In March 1943 alone, German submarines sank 95 Allied merchant ships totaling over 500,000 tons. Every day mattered. Brown Shipbuilding in Houston became the unexpected laboratory for destroyer escort mass production. George and Herman Brown had built their fortune on aggressive project management and relentless optimization. They approached destroyer escort construction with the same philosophy that had built highways ahead of schedule and under budget: break the job into smallest possible components, eliminate every wasted motion, and never accept "that's how it's always been done" as justification for inefficiency. The yard at Greens Bayou employed over 25,000 workers by late 1942, making it the second largest employer in the Houston area. Most had zero shipbuilding experience: former restaurant workers, sharecroppers, housewives, teenagers, people fleeing rural poverty for defense industry wages. They arrived at Brown Shipbuilding knowing nothing about welding, riveting, or marine architecture. The company had weeks, not years, to transform them into shipbuilders. Brown implemented training programs that were insultingly simple by traditional standards. A welder didn't learn the theory of metallurgy or the chemistry of different steel alloys. They learned one specific weld in one specific location on destroyer escort hulls, over and over, on scrap metal, until they could execute that single weld in their sleep. Then they were sent to the production line to make that one weld repeatedly on actual ships, de-skilling through hyper-specialization. Master craftsmen were horrified. Production managers were delighted. The assembly process borrowed shamelessly from automobile manufacturing. Rather than building ships traditionally, frame by frame from keel upward, Brown Shipbuilding fabricated destroyer escort sections as modules in specialized shops, then moved these prefabricated assemblies to the building ways where they were welded together in sequence. A bow section might contain 30 separate pre-welded components completed in controlled conditions before ever reaching the hull. This modular approach meant multiple destroyer escorts could be under construction simultaneously at different stages. While one hull was being assembled on the ways, bow sections for the next 3 ships were being fabricated in the shops. Engine rooms were being outfitted before the hull they'd eventually occupy even existed as more than steel plates. The production flow resembled Henry Ford's River Rouge plant more than any traditional shipyard. The first Brown Shipbuilding destroyer, Escort, USS Wiseman, D667, was laid down in October 1942. Initial projections estimated 30 weeks from keel to commissioning, slower than Mare Island but acceptable for a brand new yard learning the process. But George Brown wasn't satisfied with 30 weeks. He'd promised the Navy 1 destroyer escort per week once production hit full stride. That meant shrinking construction time to match output rate, or building multiple ships simultaneously on enough ways to average 1 completion weekly, even with longer individual build times. Brown chose both strategies. By spring 1943, the yard operated 8 building ways simultaneously, with additional vessels in various stages of prefabrication. But more importantly, the construction time itself began dropping. 30 weeks for the first destroyer escort, 26 weeks for the next, 23 weeks, 20 weeks. The learning curve was steep and brutal, paved with welding mistakes, alignment errors, and quality control failures that required expensive rework. But the curve was descending. The key breakthrough came from obsessive attention to the critical path. Every destroyer escort required thousands of individual tasks: steel cutting, frame installation, deck plate welding, pipe fitting, electrical wiring, engine installation, weapons mounting, painting, testing. Some tasks could proceed in parallel. Others formed bottlenecks where delays cascaded through the entire schedule. Brown's production managers tracked every task's duration and identified which steps limited overall speed. Welding was the obvious bottleneck. Destroyer escort hulls used welded construction rather than traditional riveted assemblies, faster in theory but requiring skilled labor that was perpetually scarce. Brown couldn't find enough welders. They couldn't train welders fast enough, so they changed the definition of what welder meant. A traditional naval welder was expected to execute dozens of different joint configurations in various positions, working with different steel thicknesses and alloy compositions. Brown Shipbuilding's welders learned 3 specific joint types in 2 specific positions using 1 specific electrode type. That's it. The complexity was stripped out and redistributed across more workers doing simpler tasks. Quality inspectors caught defects before they propagated. Rework was budgeted into the schedule. By May 1943, Brown Shipbuilding completed its first destroyer escort, USS Hissam, DE-400, in just under 6 months from keel laying. 6 months was the threshold. Faster than that, and the destroyer escort became truly mass-producible. Slower than that, and the Atlantic convoy crisis would consume merchant tonnage faster than escorts could protect them. Lieutenant Commander Watanabe Yasuji, sitting on USS George's deck after his submarine's sinking, understood none of this context. He only knew that American destroyer escorts were appearing in numbers that defied Japanese naval intelligence estimates. I-16 had encountered 3 different destroyer escorts in 2 weeks of patrol. Each bore a different hull number, indicating they weren't the same ship being seen repeatedly. 3 separate vessels, all apparently new, all operating in the Central Pacific, where no destroyer escorts had been reported months earlier. When George's intelligence officer interrogated Watanabe later that day, the Japanese lieutenant commander asked questions instead of answering them. "How many ships like this do you have?" The intelligence officer smiled. "Enough," he said. "More than enough." Watanabe pressed. 5? 10. The American's smile widened. "More. Many more. Try not to think about numbers. It'll just depress you." The truth was worse than depression. It was mathematical annihilation. By May 1944, when Watanabe's submarine went down, the United States had commissioned approximately 200 destroyer escorts. Another 300 were under construction or completing sea trials. Brown Shipbuilding alone had delivered 33 destroyer escorts by mid-1944, and their production rate had stabilized at 1 ship per week. 1 complete destroyer escort, from keel to commissioning, every 7 days, from a single yard that hadn't existed 3 years earlier. Meanwhile, the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had commissioned approximately 32 Matsu-class destroyers and 14 Itorofu-class ocean defense ships, their equivalents to destroyer escorts, during the same period. 32 destroyers in 2 years from a navy that had been building warships for decades, versus 200 destroyer escorts in 18 months from a nation that was learning destroyer construction on the fly. The production disparity wasn't just about numbers, it was about philosophy. Japanese destroyer construction followed the traditional approach. Each vessel carefully, crafted by skilled workers, quality maintained through craftsmanship, production limited by the availability of master shipwrights. American destroyer escort construction followed the industrial approach, quality maintained through inspection and rework, production limited only by raw materials and political will. Japanese Matsu-class destroyers, designed specifically for ease of construction, still required approximately 12 months from keel laying to commissioning. They were simpler than earlier fleet destroyers, with reduced armament and less sophisticated engineering. They were meant to be mass-produced, Japan's answer to the destroyer shortage that was crippling their convoy defense. But 12 months per ship meant Japan could never build enough of them. The mathematics was cruel. If you need 100 new escorts and can only build 8 per year, you'll never close the gap while losing ships to combat and operational accidents faster than replacements appear. The United States had solved this equation not through superior design or better technology, but through industrial brutality. Destroyer escorts were adequate, not excellent. Their 3-inch guns couldn't threaten surface warships. Their 21-knot maximum speed meant they couldn't catch fleet destroyers if the enemy wanted to run. Their thin hulls made them vulnerable to even medium-caliber gunfire, but they could kill submarines. They were cheap enough to build by the hundred, and most critically, they appeared fast enough to matter while the war's outcome still hung in balance. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, grasped the destroyer escort's true value in a memo dated March 1943. "These ships," he wrote, "are not meant to be the best anti-submarine vessels we can design. They're meant to be the best anti-submarine vessels we can build in quantity, with available resources, in time to affect this year's Atlantic convoy battles. Perfection delivered in 1945 wins nothing. Adequacy delivered in 1943 wins the war." This philosophy horrified traditionalists who'd spent careers perfecting warship design. The Bureau of Ships received endless complaints about destroyer escort shortcomings. The living spaces were cramped, the ventilation was inadequate, the stability in heavy seas was marginal, the crew comfort was non-existent. Every complaint was accurate. Every complaint was also irrelevant. Destroyer escorts weren't designed to be pleasant or perfect. They were designed to be numerous. The technical specifications of destroyer escorts revealed both their limitations and their purpose with brutal clarity. The Evarts class, first to enter service, displaced 1,400 tons fully loaded, barely half the weight of a Fletcher-class fleet destroyer. Length, 289 feet, making them shorter than most heavy cruisers' beams. Maximum speed, 21 knots from diesel-electric generators, producing 9,000 shaft horsepower, compared to 60,000 horsepower in fleet destroyers making 35 knots. Armament told the story of their single-minded mission. 3 3-inch, 50-caliber dual-purpose guns, adequate for engaging surfaced submarines or aircraft, useless against armoured surface ships. 8 K-gun depth-charge throwers arranged amidships, capable of hurling 300-pound depth charges in a pattern around the ship. 2 depth-charge racks at the stern for rolling charges directly off the fantail, and forward, between the number 1 and number 2 gun mounts, a Hedgehog projector. The Hedgehog was the destroyer escort's most lethal weapon, though it looked more like industrial plumbing than naval ordnance. 24 spigot mortars arranged in an elliptical pattern, each loaded with a 65-pound projectile containing 35 pounds of Torpex explosive. When fired, all 24 projectiles arced forward in a pattern covering a partering of 100-foot ellipse roughly 200 yards ahead of the ship. They sank at approximately 23 feet per second. They didn't explode on a timed fuse like depth charges. They exploded only on contact. This was revolutionary. Traditional depth charge attacks required the escort to pass directly over the submarine's estimated position, drop charges set to detonate at estimated depth, then wait while the explosions obliterated sonar contact for minutes. The submarine, hearing the destroyer pass overhead, could turn, dive, or surface during those blind minutes. Hedgehog projectiles detonated only on direct hit, meaning if you heard an explosion, you'd killed the submarine. If you heard nothing, you maintained sonar contact and could attack again immediately. The Buckley-class, second destroyer escort type, stretched the design to 306 feet and added torpedo tubes, 3 21-inch tubes in a triple mount. This generated fierce debate. Destroyer escorts were anti-submarine vessels. Torpedoes were for surface combat. Adding torpedoes added weight, complexity, and training requirements for a weapon most destroyer escorts would never fire in anger. But the Navy had learned from the Royal Navy's experience. Sometimes convoy escorts encountered surface raiders. Sometimes they fought destroyers attempting to reach convoys. Torpedoes, even 3 tubes, gave destroyer escorts a desperate last option if cornered by superior surface forces. The Cannon class and Edsall class mounted diesel-electric propulsion, chosen not for performance, but for reliability and fuel efficiency. These destroyer escorts could steam 16,000 miles at 12 knots without refueling, critical for Pacific operations where fuel tankers were scarce and operational areas measured thousands of miles from any friendly port. They sacrificed speed, topping out at barely 20 knots, but gained endurance that made them perfect for extended convoy duty. The Ruderow class and John C. Butler class, last destroyer escort types commissioned during the war, represented major departures. They mounted 5-inch 38 caliber guns, the same dual-purpose weapons equipping fleet destroyers, giving them genuine surface combat capability. They featured completely redesigned superstructures, lower and more streamlined than earlier classes, reducing topside weight and improving stability. 72 rudder rows were built, most immediately converted to high-speed transports before ever serving as destroyer escorts, proof that the basic hull design was versatile enough for multiple missions. But the revolutionary aspect of destroyer escort production wasn't the ships themselves. It was the system that produced them. By late 1943, Brown Shipbuilding had refined destroyer escort construction into a precisely choreographed industrial process that would have been recognizable to Henry Ford but alien to traditional naval architects. The process began in the steel fabrication shops, massive covered structures where raw steel arrived by rail from Pittsburgh mills and left as hull sections ready for assembly. Each destroyer escort required approximately 1,100 tons of steel in dozens of different grades and thicknesses. Armor plate for the gun tubs and magazine spaces, special treatment steel for high-stress areas, standard ship plate for the hull and superstructure. The steel arrived pre-cut to specifications from the mills, eliminating on-site cutting operations that created bottlenecks. Workers in the fabrication shops welded these plates into three-dimensional sections, typically no larger than 30 feet in any dimension. A hull side panel might measure 28 feet long by 12 feet high, pre-fitted with frame sections, stiffeners, and penetrations for pipes and cables. These sections were welded following strict sequences developed through painful trial and error, sequences that minimized warping and residual stress in the steel. Every completed section went into stress relief ovens, heated to 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, and slowly cooled. This annealing process allowed the steel's crystalline structure to relax, dissipating internal stresses locked into the metal during welding. Liberty ships early in the war had suffered catastrophic failures from welding stress, whole vessels splitting in half at sea. The destroyer escort program had learned from those failures. Stress relief was mandatory, time-consuming, and non-negotiable. The building ways at Brown Shipbuilding ran parallel to Green's Bayou, 8 slipways where destroyer escort hulls took shape with startling speed. But unlike traditional ship construction that started at the keel and built upward frame by frame, Brown's method assembled large modules almost simultaneously. The keel sections, bottom plates, and lower hull frames were positioned first, but rather than completing the entire lower hull before starting sides and decks, workers immediately began positioning mid-hull sections and upper works. Massive gantry cranes, some capable of lifting 40 tons, positioned prefabricated sections with inch-perfect precision. A typical destroyer escort might be assembled from 70 to 90 major modules, each prefabbed in the shops. These modules arrived at the building ways in strict sequence, determined by the critical path that production managers updated daily. The stern section with propeller shafts and rudder went in early because nothing else could be positioned until it was locked in place. Engine room modules went in next because they were the heaviest and required the crane's full capacity. Welders connected these modules using the same center outward sequences developed in the fabrication shops. The critical welds, those joining major structural sections, received extraordinary attention. Each weld was inspected 3 times, once by the welder's supervisor immediately after completion, once by a quality control inspector using magnetic particle testing to reveal microscopic cracks, and finally by ultrasonic inspection that checked internal weld quality invisible to the eye. Welds that failed inspection were ground out and redone immediately. No exceptions. The launch itself was a spectacle bordering on controlled chaos. Because Green's Bayou was too narrow for traditional bow-first launches, Brown Shipbuilding launched destroyer escorts sideways. The hull sat on a cradle on rails perpendicular to the bayou. On launch day, workers removed the blocks, holding the cradle in place. The hull, cradle and all, slid sideways down greased rails, accelerating until it hit the water with a massive splash and wave that surged across the narrow channel. The hull settled, floating for the first time, while tugboats scrambled to capture it before it drifted into the opposite bank. After launch came the fitting-out period, when destroyer escorts transformed from empty hulls into functional warships. This work happened pierside, with the hull moored to a fitting-out dock where it could receive electrical power, compressed air, and access for workers to install the systems that made it a ship. Electrical wiring, thousands of feet of cable connecting everything from the engine room, telegraphs to the radio room, to the gun mounts, piping for fuel, water, steam, hydraulics, fire suppression, weapons installation, mounting the guns, depth charge projectors, torpedo tubes if the class carried them. The engine rooms received their power plants in a carefully orchestrated operation that typically required 8 hours of precise crane work. Diesel engines weighing tens of thousands of pounds were lowered through deck hatches into engine rooms, barely large enough to contain them. Generators followed, then reduction gears, then the massive electric motors that actually turned the propeller shafts. Connecting these components required alignment to thousandths of an inch. Misalignment meant vibration, bearing failure, and eventual breakdown at sea. Brown Shipbuilding, by mid-1944, had reduced destroyer escort construction time to an average of 20 weeks from keel laying to commissioning. 20 weeks, just under 5 months, from the first steel plate positioned on the way to a complete warship ready for sea trials. This wasn't the 4-day timeline the title suggested, which referred more to the launch rate once multiple ships were in production simultaneously, but it was revolutionary nonetheless. 1 destroyer escort per week leaving Brown Shipbuilding, another every 10 days from Consolidated Steel in Orange, Texas. More from Philadelphia, Boston, Mare Island. Every yard contributed to a flood of escort vessels that transformed the Battle of the Atlantic. By May 1944, when Lieutenant Commander Watanabe went into the water off the Philippines, the United States had commissioned over 200 destroyer escorts with another 300 under construction or completing trials. The impact on anti-submarine warfare was measurable and dramatic. In March 1943, at the height of the U-boat crisis, German submarines sank 95 Allied merchant ships. By March 1944, after hundreds of destroyer escorts entered service, that number had dropped to 3 ships in a month, down from 95 the previous year. The destroyer escorts hadn't won this victory alone. Long-range aircraft, escort carriers, improved radar and sonar, broken German codes, all contributed. But destroyer escorts provided the numbers that made hunter-killer operations possible. Enough escorts existed that convoys could be protected, while still detaching vessels to pursue submarine contacts to exhaustion. Before destroyer escorts, breaking off pursuit meant leaving the convoy vulnerable. After destroyer escorts arrived in numbers, there were enough ships to do both jobs simultaneously. The Pacific War told a different story. Japanese submarines operated under different doctrine than German U-boats. They targeted warships, not merchantmen. They positioned themselves along predicted fleet routes rather than hunting convoys. This made them less of a shipping threat but more dangerous to major combatants. Destroyer escorts in the Pacific found themselves assigned to escort carriers, replenishment groups, and amphibious forces rather than cargo convoys. But the Pacific also revealed destroyer escorts' most unexpected capability. On October 25, 1944, off the Philippine island of Samar, 4 destroyer escorts proved that mass-produced adequacy could become heroism when necessity demanded. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, had scattered American forces across hundreds of miles of Philippine waters. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the powerful Third Fleet with its fast battleships and fleet carriers, had taken the bait. Japanese carriers, nearly empty of aircraft but still potent as decoys, lured Halsey north, pulling the covering force away from the invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf. This left the landing area protected only by escort carriers. Slow, small, designed to provide air support for ground troops, not fight surface battles. And it left those escort carriers protected by destroyer escorts. Taffy 3. The radio call sign for Escort Carrier Task Unit 77.4.3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 Fletcher-class fleet destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, and USS Raymond. At dawn on October 25th, they were conducting routine flight operations east of Samar when lookouts spotted pagoda masts on the horizon. Japanese battleships. The center force, 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato at 65,000 tons, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Admiral Takeo Kurita's fleet, thought to be retreating after air attacks the previous day, had reversed course overnight and was now bearing down on the undefended invasion beaches, with only Taffy 3 standing between them and catastrophe. The mathematics was brutal. Yamato alone outweighed all 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts in Taffy, 3 combined. Her 18-inch guns could obliterate an escort carrier with a single salvo from 20 miles away. The destroyer escort's 3-inch guns couldn't penetrate Yamato's belt armor if they fired from 3 feet. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, ordered the escort carriers to flee eastward at maximum speed, barely 18 knots, while the screening destroyers and destroyer escorts laid smoke to hide them. The Japanese opened fire at 7:01 a.m. 18-inch shells, throwing geysers hundreds of feet high as they bracketed the fleeing carriers. Sprague knew his escort carriers wouldn't make it. The Japanese were faster, better armed, and would overtake them within hours. He needed a miracle or a sacrifice. He got both. At 7:16 a.m., Sprague ordered the destroyers and destroyer escorts to conduct a torpedo attack. Not a hit-and-run strike, but a sustained charge directly at the Japanese battle line. The order essentially read, "Go die to buy the carriers time." The destroyers and destroyer escorts didn't hesitate. USS Samuel B. Roberts, Destroyer Escort 413, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, was the newest ship in Taffy 3, commissioned just 4 months earlier in April 1944. She displaced 1,400 tons, mounted 2 5-inch guns and 3 21-inch torpedoes. She was accelerating toward 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and multiple destroyers whose combined displacement exceeded 200,000 tons. Copeland addressed his crew over the announcing system. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The crew, average age barely 20 years old, most having never seen combat before that morning, manned their stations and charged into hell. The destroyer escorts attacked through the smoke, closing to point-blank range before Japanese gunners could target them effectively. Samuel B. Roberts released all 3 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Chokai from less than 5,000 yards, close enough to see Japanese sailors on her deck. 1 torpedo struck Chokai's stern, destroying her steering and propulsion. The cruiser went dead in the water, eventually scuttled by Japanese destroyers. But the torpedo attack was just the beginning of Samuel B. Roberts's fight. For the next hour, she engaged Japanese heavy cruisers with her 5-inch guns. 5-inch guns against 8-inch cruiser main batteries. 1,400-ton destroyer escort against 10,000-ton heavy cruisers. The engagement was absurd, suicidal, and completely ineffective by traditional metrics. Samuel B. Roberts's 5-inch shells couldn't penetrate cruiser belt armor, but they could wreck superstructures, disable fire control directors, kill exposed crew, and most importantly, force the Japanese cruisers to maneuver, turn, and focus on the attacking tin cans rather than the fleeing carriers. At 8:30 a.m., Japanese heavy cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, concentrated fire on Samuel B. Roberts from 8,000 yards. 14-inch shells, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, began finding their target. 1 shell penetrated the aft engine room, killing everyone inside instantly and cutting the destroyer escort's speed in half. Another shell demolished the aft 5-inch gun, killing the entire gun crew. A 3rd shell detonated in the port engine room. Samuel B. Roberts, engines destroyed, began to list as water poured into shattered compartments. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The crew fought to save their ship with desperate damage control efforts that kept her afloat for another 40 minutes. But at 9 to 10 a.m., with the deck plates glowing red from fires below, ammunition exploding in the heat, and the list passing 30 degrees, Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. Samuel B. Roberts capsized and sank at 9:35 a.m. She had been in combat for 2 hours and 35 minutes. Of her crew of 224, 90 were killed in action or died in the water over the following 2 days before rescue arrived. USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, and USS Raymond survived the battle, though Dennis and Butler both suffered damage from near-miss shells. The 3 Fletcher-class fleet destroyers, USS Johnston, USS Hoel, and USS Heermann, fought with equal desperation. Johnston and Hoel were sunk. Heermann survived despite massive damage, but the destroyers and destroyer escorts had achieved the impossible. They'd delayed the Japanese center force long enough for Taffy 3's escort carriers to launch repeated airstrikes. They'd inflicted damage on multiple Japanese cruisers and destroyers. They'd created chaos in Kurita's formation, forcing ships to scatter under torpedo attacks rather than maintaining formation for a coordinated assault on the carriers. And most critically, they'd convinced Kurita that he was facing fleet destroyers protecting fleet carriers, not destroyer escorts protecting escort carriers. Kurita, unnerved by the ferocity of resistance from ships that should have been easily destroyed, uncertain of what other forces might be approaching, worried about his damaged cruisers and depleted destroyers, ordered a retreat at 9:30 a.m. The center force turned north and withdrew through San Bernardino Strait. The invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf, left undefended by Halsey's pursuit of the Japanese carriers, were saved by 6 escort carriers and 7 tin cans that charged a fleet they couldn't possibly defeat. The battle off Samar entered history as the last stand of the tin can sailors, Samuel B. Roberts earned the nickname the Destroyer Escort that fought like a battleship. But the battle also revealed something uncomfortable about destroyer escort design and American naval doctrine. These ships had been optimized for anti-submarine warfare, built for adequacy rather than excellence, produced in numbers rather than perfected in capability. When forced into surface combat against ships they were never designed to fight, they died. 90 men from Samuel B. Roberts, over 600 from Johnston, over 200 from Hoel. The destroyer escorts' 3-inch guns and destroyers' 5-inch guns couldn't meaningfully damage Japanese heavy cruisers at combat ranges. Their thin hulls offered no protection against 8-inch or 14-inch shells. They won through desperation and sacrifice, not through design excellence. Japanese post-battle reports revealed confusion and respect in equal measures. Survivors from the heavy cruiser Chikuma, sunk later that day by air attack after being damaged in the surface battle, told interrogators they'd assumed they were fighting Brooklyn-class light cruisers based on the volume and accuracy of fire. When told they'd been engaged by destroyer escorts and fleet destroyers, not cruisers, Japanese officers were stunned. Why would destroyer escorts charge battleships? It violated all tactical doctrine. Ships that small should evade, not attack. The answer was simple and brutal. There was nowhere to evade to. The escort carriers behind them couldn't run fast enough. Standing and fighting bought time. Time meant more airstrikes. More airstrikes meant Kurita might withdraw. It was desperation mathematics, calculated in seconds of survival purchased with sailors' lives. But the Battle off Samar also demonstrated the destroyer escort program's core philosophy. These ships existed in sufficient numbers that losing some didn't cripple the fleet. Samuel B. Roberts was Destroyer Escort 413. 412 other destroyer escorts were commissioned, under construction, or planned. Losing one, while tragic for her crew, didn't significantly impact the overall escort force. This calculation would have horrified naval commanders in any previous era. Ships were expensive, difficult to replace, and therefore precious. You didn't throw them away in desperate charges. But American industrial capacity in World War II had changed that equation. Destroyer escorts cost $3.3 million. The United States was spending $250 billion prosecuting the war. Destroyer escorts were consumable assets, important but replaceable. Japanese naval doctrine had never contemplated such abundance. Every destroyer in the Imperial, Japanese Navy was a valuable asset, carefully husbanded, committed to battle only when necessary. Losing a destroyer was a significant event requiring investigation and explanation. The idea of building ships so cheaply and quickly that their loss was acceptable, even expected, contradicted everything Japanese naval architects had been taught. Lieutenant Commander Watanabe Yasuji, being interrogated aboard USS George after his submarine sinking, tried to explain this to the intelligence officer questioning him. In Japan, he said through a translator, building a destroyer takes 1 year minimum. Experienced workers, precise manufacturing, careful inspection. We cannot build ships faster without compromising quality. The intelligence officer nodded. He'd heard similar statements from other captured Japanese naval officers. The American response was consistent. We've accepted that compromise. Destroyer escorts aren't as good as fleet destroyers. They're not meant to be. They're meant to be numerous enough that we can assign them to every convoy, every escort carrier group, every amphibious operation. Quality through quantity, excellence through adequacy multiplied. Watanabe couldn't grasp this philosophy. It violated his entire understanding of shipbuilding and naval warfare. But watching USS George operate over the following days as she transported him to an interrogation center in Hawaii, he began to understand. The destroyer escort was rough, uncomfortable, cramped, ventilation was poor, living spaces were primitive, but she was reliable. Her engines ran smoothly. Her sonar was excellent. Her crew was young but competent. She was, in every sense, adequate, and there were hundreds more just like her. The numbers arrived at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo through multiple channels throughout 1944, each report more alarming than the last. Submarine commanders who survived encounters with American destroyer escorts filed action reports, noting hull numbers in the DE-300s, then DE-400s, then DE-500s. Naval intelligence officers, interrogating American prisoners captured during carrier raids, tried to extract information about ship production. Photo reconnaissance of American shipyards on the West Coast showed dozens of destroyer escorts in various stages of construction simultaneously. But the numbers didn't make sense. Mathematics was impossible. Captain Nakamura Toshihiko, assigned to the Naval General Staff's intelligence section, compiled destroyer escort sighting reports into a comprehensive assessment delivered to the staff in August 1944. His conclusion: American destroyer escort production had reached approximately 150 vessels, commissioned with another 200 under construction or completing trials. 350 destroyer escorts total, representing production capacity that exceeded the entire Imperial Japanese Navy's destroyer construction since 1920. The Naval General Staff rejected Nakamura's report as an obvious error. Intelligence estimates, they informed him, must be based on realistic industrial capacity assessments. The United States possessed approximately 16 major shipyards capable of destroyer construction. Assuming each yard could produce 1 destroyer every 8 months, maximum American production capacity was perhaps 24 destroyers annually. Over 2 years of war that suggested fewer than 50 destroyers total, and destroyer escorts, being smaller, shouldn't exceed double that number. Nakamura's estimate of 350 destroyer escorts implied construction rates 5 times faster than Japanese analysts believed possible. The report was filed away as unreliable intelligence corrupted by wartime confusion and exaggeration. But the reports kept coming. Destroyer escorts continued appearing across the Pacific. DE-600 series hull numbers were spotted off the Marianas in June 1944. DE-700 series numbers appeared near the Philippines in September. By October, reports mentioned DE-750. The hull numbers alone indicated at least 750 destroyer escorts had been ordered, though surely not all had been completed yet. In November 1944, the Naval General Staff commissioned a second assessment, this time led by Captain Yamamoto Kenji, who had studied American industrial capacity before the war during a naval attaché assignment in Washington. Yamamoto's report, delivered in December, was brutal in its honesty. American destroyer escort production, he concluded, had exceeded 500 vessels, commissioned with another 200 under construction. The United States was completing approximately 30 destroyer escorts monthly across multiple shipyards, a production rate that suggested total program size approaching 800 to 1,000 vessels. The report included a detailed explanation of how this was possible. American shipyards building destroyer escorts weren't traditional naval facilities. They were civilian yards operated by construction companies using mass production techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. They employed largely unskilled labor trained for specific repetitive tasks rather than comprehensive craftsmanship. They built ships from prefabricated modules rather than frame-by-frame construction. They sacrificed individual ship quality for production speed, accepting that some vessels would have defects discovered only after commissioning. Most critically, Yamamoto noted, American destroyer escort production didn't compete with fleet destroyer construction. Different yards, different labor pools, different supply chains. The United States was building both simultaneously. Fleet destroyer production continued at roughly one ship per week from specialized naval yards, while destroyer escort production added another 6 to 8 ships weekly from civilian facilities. This time, the Naval General Staff couldn't dismiss the report. Too many hull number sightings corroborated Yamamoto's estimates. The mathematics, while staggering, were internally consistent. If the United States commissioned 500 destroyer escorts by late 1944 and was still building 30 per month, the program would exceed 700 vessels by war's end. The strategic implications were catastrophic for Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with approximately 170 destroyers of all types. By late 1944, attrition had reduced that number to fewer than 60 operational destroyers. Japanese shipyards were producing approximately 3 destroyers monthly, mostly the simplified Matsu class designed for rapid construction. At current loss rates, the destroyer force would be completely exhausted by mid-1945. Meanwhile, the United States had more destroyer escorts alone than Japan had destroyers, destroyer escorts, and all other escort vessels combined. And American production showed no signs of slowing. The submarine war in the Pacific, once dominated by Japanese boats threatening American convoys and amphibious operations, had reversed completely. American submarines roamed Japanese waters, almost unopposed, because Japan lacked sufficient escorts to protect even critical merchant shipping. The oil tankers bringing petroleum from the Dutch East Indies to Japan sailed with minimal escort, often a single Kaibokan ocean defense ship protecting 10 or more tankers. American submarines exploited this vulnerability ruthlessly. By late 1944, Japanese merchant ship losses exceeded replacement construction by ratios of 5 to 1. The economy was bleeding to death, starved of oil, raw materials, and food imports, while the Imperial Japanese Navy watched helplessly, lacking the escorts to protect convoys adequately. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, understood the strategic bind perfectly. In a conference with the Naval General Staff in December 1944, he presented the logic starkly. Japan could not win the destroyer production race. Even if Japanese shipyards tripled output, which was impossible given material shortages and bombing damage, they couldn't approach American production capacity. The only viable strategy was to preserve the remaining destroyer force for a decisive engagement, while accepting that merchant shipping would suffer catastrophic losses in the interim. This strategy was, essentially, surrender disguised as tactics. It meant abandoning merchant protection, which meant accepting economic strangulation. It meant hoarding the fleet for a battle that grew less likely daily as American forces tightened the noose. But it was the only option when facing an enemy who could absorb losses you couldn't replace while producing new ships faster than you could sink them. The human cost of American destroyer escort production received less attention than the strategic mathematics, but it was substantial and revealing. Building 563 destroyer escorts between 1943 and 1945 required approximately 100 million man-hours of labor. That represented roughly 50,000 workers employed full-time for 2 years across 16 shipyards. These weren't career shipbuilders. The traditional naval construction workforce had been absorbed by fleet destroyer, cruiser, and carrier programs. Destroyer escort yards employed whoever showed up. Women who'd never worked outside the home before the war, African Americans fleeing southern agricultural poverty for defense industry wages, teenagers lying about their age to earn adult pay, Mexican laborers recruited from border states, people with disabilities that disqualified them from military service but didn't prevent factory work. Brown Shipbuilding in Houston, at peak employment in mid-1944, had over 27,000 workers on payroll. Approximately 40% were women. 30% were African American or Hispanic. The yard operated 3 shifts, 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Workers lived in company housing hastily constructed on land adjacent to the shipyard, entire neighborhoods of temporary barracks and trailer parks that would be demolished after the war. The work was dangerous. Welding accidents caused burns, eye damage from inadequate protection, and fires in confined spaces filled with flammable materials. Heavy components dropped from cranes, crushed workers. Toxic fumes from paint and solvents sickened people in poorly ventilated compartments. Falls from scaffolding and ladders killed or crippled. Brown Shipbuilding recorded 47 worker deaths from industrial accidents between 1942 and 1945, a rate of roughly 16 deaths per 1,000 workers annually, 10 times higher than peacetime industrial fatality rates. But workers kept coming because the wages were unprecedented. A welder at Brown Shipbuilding in 1944 earned approximately 1.10 cents per hour, roughly $45 weekly for a 40-hour week with time and a half for overtime. In rural Texas and Louisiana, where many workers originated, agricultural labor paid perhaps $3 weekly. Defense industry wages represented economic transformation, the difference between subsistence poverty and middle-class comfort. The racial dynamics in destroyer escort shipyards reflected broader American society's contradictions. African American workers were employed in large numbers but segregated into specific job categories. They could be welders, shipfitters, and laborers, but rarely supervisors or inspectors. Separate facilities for changing rooms, cafeterias, and rest areas were standard practice. When black workers protested these conditions at Brown Shipbuilding in mid-1943, management's response was characteristic of the era. We'll fire anyone who causes production delays, regardless of their grievances' legitimacy. Women faced different but equally systemic discrimination. They were paid 70 to 80% of male wages for identical work under the justification that men had families to support, while women were working temporarily until husbands returned from military service. Sexual harassment was pervasive and largely ignored by management, unless it disrupted production. Opportunities for advancement into supervisory roles were minimal, regardless of competence or experience. Yet these workers, despite facing discrimination, inadequate safety protections, and brutal working conditions, built the ships that won the anti-submarine war. The destroyer escorts launching from Brown Shipbuilding carried the labor of people whose names appeared nowhere in official histories. The welder who made 10,000 identical seam welds over 2 years received no commendation when submarines sank from depth charges her ship delivered. The electrician who wired fire control systems enabling accurate hedgehog attacks got no recognition when those attacks killed enemy sailors. This invisibility was intentional and systematic. Wartime propaganda celebrated Rosie the Riveter and praised defense industry workers in abstract terms, while avoiding specifics about wages, working conditions, or the demographic reality of who actually built the weapons. After the war, histories focused on admirals, ship captains, and tactical decisions, while treating industrial production as background context rather than the foundation enabling every naval victory. The destroyer escorts themselves, after the war ended, faced an uncertain fate. The U.S. Navy had commissioned 563 destroyer escorts by August 1945. Suddenly, with Japan's surrender, the Navy had hundreds of pauta, escort vessels designed for a war that no longer existed. Destroyer escorts were specialized anti-submarine platforms optimized for convoy protection against submarine wolf packs. In peacetime, their utility was questionable. Decommissioning began almost immediately. By December 1945, over 100 destroyer escorts had been placed in reserve status, mothballed at various naval facilities to rust quietly while waiting for potential future conflicts. By 1946, 200 destroyer escorts sat in reserve. By 1950, before the Korean War temporarily reversed the trend, over 400 destroyer escorts were inactive. Some found new purposes. 94 destroyer escorts were converted to high-speed transports, designated APD, with reduced armament and added troop capacity. These vessels served in Korea, Vietnam, and various smaller conflicts through the 1960s. 36 destroyer escorts became radar picket ships, designated DER, with enhanced radar and communications equipment for early warning missions during the Cold War. 78 destroyer escorts went to the British Royal Navy under Lend-Lease as captain-class frigates during the war, and most were returned to American custody by 1947. Many were immediately scrapped, their hulls cut up for scrap steel worth more than the cost of maintaining them. Other destroyer escorts were transferred to Allied navies. 8 went to Brazil, 6 to France, multiple units to South Korea, Taiwan, and other nations seeking naval capability they couldn't build domestically. By the 1970s, almost all World War II destroyer escorts had been decommissioned, scrapped, or transferred. A handful served into the 1970s as training vessels or experimental platforms. Today, only 2 destroyer escorts survive. USS Slater, DE-766, a Cannon-class destroyer escort, is preserved as a museum ship in Albany, New York. USS Stewart, DE-238, an Edsall-class destroyer escort, sits on static display in Galveston, Texas. The legacy of destroyer escort production extended far beyond the ships themselves. The mass production techniques developed for destroyer escorts influenced post-war naval construction for decades. Modular construction, prefabricated sections, and systematic quality inspection became standard practice. The Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates, designed in the 1970s as Cold War destroyer escorts, incorporated lessons learned 30 years earlier about balancing capability with producibility. The workforce that built destroyer escorts transformed American industry and demographics permanently. Women who entered defense industry work during the war didn't all return to domestic roles afterward. Many continued working, using skills and confidence gained in shipyards to pursue careers that would have been inaccessible before the war. The economic independence defense industry, and wages provided, gave women leverage to demand better treatment, equal pay, and workplace protections that gradually improved in subsequent decades. African Americans who migrated north and west for defense industry jobs during the war mostly stayed in those regions afterward, contributing to demographic shifts that reshaped American cities. The economic prosperity these workers found, while limited by continued discrimination, provided resources for civil rights organizing and activism in the 1950s and 60s. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s observation that the war had given African Americans a taste of equality they wouldn't forget traced directly to experiences like working in defense industries where competence mattered more than traditional social hierarchies. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the revelation about destroyer escort production came too late to affect strategy, but early enough to shape post-war understanding. Lieutenant Commander Watanabe Yasuji, captured in May 1944, spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Hawaii. After Japan's surrender, he was repatriated in late 1945 and eventually returned to civilian life. In the 1950s, he wrote a memoir about his wartime experiences that included his reactions to American destroyer escort production. The section on this topic was titled "The War We Could Not Win," and Watanabe described the moment he understood the scale of American industrial capacity. It wasn't during interrogation, where intelligence officers remained deliberately vague about production numbers. It wasn't from seeing multiple destroyer escorts, which could have been explained by concentration of forces. It was a chance conversation with an American sailor guarding prisoners, who mentioned casually that his brother also served on a destroyer escort, a different one, built at a different shipyard, commissioned the same month. That detail, Watanabe wrote, made the abstract concrete. Not just many destroyer escorts, but so many that brothers could serve on different ships built simultaneously at different yards. It suggested production capacity so vast that individual ships were routine, unremarkable. For a Japanese naval officer trained to treat each warship as precious and irreplaceable, this abundance represented a fundamental philosophical difference about naval power. America built ships the way Japan built rifles, standardized, numerous, individually unimportant but collectively decisive. The final American destroyer escort production numbers vindicated Yamamoto's December 1944 intelligence assessment. 563 destroyer escorts were commissioned between January 1943 and August 1945. An additional 442 destroyer escorts were ordered but cancelled before completion after Japan's surrender, bringing total program size to over 1,000 vessels. Peak production occurred in May 1944, when 41 destroyer escorts were commissioned in a single month. That represented one destroyer escort every 18 hours, averaged across all shipyards. Brown Shipbuilding alone delivered 8 destroyer escorts in May 1944, averaging one ship every 3.8 days. This was the origin of the "every 4 days" claim, though it referred specifically to Brown Shipbuilding's peak month rather than sustained production across the entire war. For comparison, the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned approximately 170 destroyers, destroyer escorts, and ocean defense ships combined during the same period. The United States built more than 3 times as many escort vessels as Japan built total combat ships of all types. And American destroyer escort production didn't even include the 223 destroyer escorts built for Britain under Lend-Lease, bringing the combined Allied total to nearly 800 vessels. Admiral King's March 1943 memo about prioritizing adequate ships built quickly over perfect ships, built slowly, had proven prophetic. Destroyer escorts weren't the best anti-submarine vessels theoretically possible, but they were the best anti-submarine vessels actually deployed in sufficient numbers to matter when the war's outcome hung in balance. German U-boat losses tell the story quantitatively. In 1942, before destroyer escorts entered service in numbers, German submarines sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping while losing 87 U-boats, a loss rate of approximately 7%. In 1944, after hundreds of destroyer escorts joined the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boats sank under 800,000 tons while losing 241 boats, a loss rate over 20%. The U-boat force, which had nearly strangled Britain in 1942, was effectively defeated by mid-1944. Destroyer escorts, combined with escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft, made submarine operations in the Atlantic suicidally dangerous. The same transformation occurred in the Pacific, where American submarines dominated Japanese waters, partly because destroyer escorts protected American supply lines, while Japan lacked equivalent escort strength. But the victory came at cost that histories often minimize. Over 3,000 American sailors died serving aboard destroyer escorts during World War II. Some died in dramatic surface actions like the Battle off Samar, More died in obscure, undocumented encounters with submarines, mines, or aircraft. The destroyer escorts that sank took their crews with them, drowning in cold Atlantic waters or shark-infested Pacific seas, dying in vessels built with deliberate acceptance that some would have defects, some would fail, and some losses were acceptable costs of rapid production. The workers who built destroyer escorts paid different costs. 47 deaths at Brown shipbuilding alone, multiplied across 16 shipyards, suggested perhaps 500 to 600 workers died in industrial accidents during destroyer escort production. Thousands more suffered permanent injuries, lost limbs, blindness, chronic respiratory disease from toxic fumes, burns leaving disfiguring scars. These casualties received no medals, no memorials, no mention in victory celebrations. They were industrial accidents, regrettable but inevitable, acknowledged in company safety reports and promptly forgotten. The racial and gender discrimination defense workers faced during the war continued afterward, perhaps even intensified as returning servicemen reclaimed jobs with preferential hiring. African American workers who'd earned skilled wages building destroyer escorts found themselves pushed back into lower-paying, lower-status employment. Women who'd proven themselves as capable welders and electricians were fired to make room for men, told their services were no longer needed now that the crisis had passed. This betrayal of the workers who'd built the tools of victory was systematic and deliberate. It reflected America's unwillingness to extend wartime economic opportunity into peacetime equality. The same government that had mobilized these workers for defense production made no effort to protect their jobs or living standards once their labor was no longer critical. The destroyer escort program's human legacy was thus complex and uncomfortable. Industrial triumph built on exploitation that was abandoned rather than remedied, once victory was secure. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. 61 destroyer escorts launched from a single shipyard that hadn't existed before the war. 563 destroyer escorts total, built in under 3 years by workers who'd never built ships before. Production rates that peaked at one ship every 18 hours averaged across all yards, numbers that Japanese intelligence couldn't believe. That the Naval General Staff dismissed as impossible proved accurate only when the war ended and final tallies could be verified. Lieutenant Commander Watanabe Yasuji returned to Japan in late 1945, carrying knowledge that explained his Navy's defeat more clearly than any tactical analysis. Japan had fought a production war against an opponent whose industrial capacity was literally unimaginable to Japanese planners. The destroyer escorts weren't superior warships. They were adequate warships produced in numbers that transformed adequacy into overwhelming superiority. The lesson applied beyond naval warfare. In every domain, material, industrial, logistical, the United States had demonstrated capacity to produce military equipment faster than enemies could, destroy it while maintaining quality sufficient for purpose. This was the real revolution. Not technological superiority, but industrial dominance, applied systematically. The destroyer escorts rusting in reserve fleets after the war represented both triumph and waste. Triumph because they'd been built fast enough and numerous enough to matter when deployed. Waste because hundreds sat unused, their production capacity exceeded by the enemy's collapse. But this was deliberate. The United States had built assuming extended war against enemies who wouldn't surrender. Excess capacity was insurance, not a mistake. For the workers who'd built these ships, the aftermath was less clear. They'd transformed American industry, proven that mass production could apply to complex military equipment, and demonstrated that unskilled labor could be trained rapidly for sophisticated manufacturing. But they received little recognition and less reward. Their contributions faded from public memory within years, displaced by narratives focusing on combat rather than production. The last destroyer escort decommissioned from U.S. Navy service was USS Vaman, DE 144, in 1973, nearly 30 years after her commissioning. She'd served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, been converted from anti-submarine escort to radar picket to training vessel, and finally outlasted her usefulness. She was sold for scrap in 1974, cut up in a breaker's yard for metal worth perhaps $50,000, less than 2% of her original construction cost. With her scrapping, an era ended. The emergency shipbuilding programs that had produced vessels by the hundreds, the mass production techniques that treated complex warships as standardized products, the willingness to accept adequate rather than demanding perfect, all these faded into history. Modern naval construction returned to traditional approaches, smaller numbers of more sophisticated vessels, longer production times, emphasis on individual ship capability over fleet size. Whether this represented progress or regression remained debatable. The destroyer escorts had won their war through numbers and adequacy. Modern frigates, their spiritual successors, cost 20 times as much, take 10 times as long to build, and exist in tiny numbers by comparison. They're technologically superior in every measurable way, but they're too expensive and too scarce to risk in situations where World War II commanders would have committed destroyer escorts without hesitation. The destroyer escort program's fundamental insight that adequate vessels built quickly can be more strategically valuable than perfect vessels built slowly seems to have been forgotten, or perhaps remembered but rejected as incompatible with modern naval warfare's complexity. Either way, the 563 destroyer escorts commissioned between 1943 and 1945 remain a unique moment in naval history. Mass production applied successfully to warship construction, industrial capacity transformed into naval power, adequacy multiplied into excellence. For the Japanese sailors who encountered these vessels in combat, the destroyer escorts represented something beyond tactical threat. They embodied American industrial philosophy. Problems solved through abundance rather than perfection. Advantages gained through multiplication rather than optimization. A destroyer escort might not be as good as a Japanese destroyer in any single category, but 6 destroyer escorts assigned to one convoy defeated one superior destroyer through numbers alone. This was the war Japan couldn't win. Not because Japanese technology was inferior, though radar and damage control lagged American standards. Not because Japanese tactics were faulty, though overemphasis on offensive operations while neglecting defensive capabilities proved catastrophic. But because Japanese industrial capacity couldn't match American production across sustained conflict. The destroyer escorts, more than any other weapons system, quantified that disparity in units that couldn't be disputed. 1 every 4 days at peak from a single yard, 1 every 18 hours averaged nationally, over 500 total while Japan built 33 equivalent vessels. The mathematics was simple, the implications were devastating, and the lesson remains relevant. In industrial warfare, production capacity determines outcomes more than individual weapons quality. The destroyer escorts proved it conclusively. Launched sideways into narrow Texas bayous by workers who'd never built ships before, adequately designed and abundantly produced, winning their war through multiplication of adequacy into overwhelming force.